A history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Things recently got heated up to the extreme. On October 7, 2023, Hamas, the armed group controlling the Gaza Strip, decided to premiere a new season with a large-scale rocket attack on Israel. The consequences were severe casualties and many hostages taken. Israel, of course, couldn't just sit back. They responded with a fierce campaign of airstrikes and shelling, declaring their goal was the total eradication of Hamas, a goal that history has proven is much easier said than done. Before things could even cool down, boom, on July 31, 2024, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was taken out in an assassination in Tehran, Iran. This event was like a powerful shove, dragging Iran, a big player in the region, deeper into the conflict. Now, people aren't just worried about an all-out war between Israel and Palestine. They're starting to whisper those two terrifying words. World War. Well, you know. Many people, when they hear about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often just shrug and say, just those religious folks fighting again. But no, my friends. Although religion is an essential spice, the main course here is actually real estate. Specifically, a conflict over sovereignty of the exact same piece of land. Let's rewind to over a century ago, around 1878. The area in the eastern Mediterranean, which we now call Israel-Palestine, was then under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. The population in Palestine at that time was mainly Muslim Arabs, with a small number of Christians and Jews. Despite their religious differences, they lived in peace. However, things started to change when the British showed up. Just like in every movie, there's always an outside power that comes to stir the pot. The British, with the keen eye of an empire, wanted to control this region. Why? Because it lay on the vital trade route to their gold mine, India. They didn't want this route interrupted, not even by a traffic jam. Right at this time, World War I broke out. The Ottoman Empire was on its way to retirement. The Arabs, who weren't particularly fond of their Ottoman boss anyway, started a political movement. They wanted to go independent and establish a unified Arab nation, which would include the Palestine region. The British, experts at sniffing out opportunities, immediately seized the chance. In 1916, they patted the Arabs on the back. "Hey buddy, just help us deal with the Ottomans. When it's done, we promise to support you in establishing your new nation." Deal? It sounded like a sweet deal. But the British weren't philanthropists. At the same time, over in Europe, another movement was growing stronger: the Zionist movement. The Jewish people, after centuries of wandering, persecution, abuse, and expulsion from one country after another, believed they were not just a religion, but a nation. And this nation needed its own country. They believed a Jewish state was the only solution to ensure their safety. And in their history, they remembered a Jewish state that had existed thousands of years ago. In the very Middle Eastern region we're talking about. And so, in 1917, just 1 year after dealing with the Arabs, the British decided to pull a U-turn. They issued the legendary Balfour Declaration. Basically, this was a 67-word love letter expressing support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The British had promised the bride, Palestine, to the Jews, while the bride was still at home, completely unaware, and the first suitor, the Arabs, was still busy fighting on the front lines, believing the matchmaker's promise. Of course, this declaration was met with fierce opposition from the Arabs. In the text, the British referred to them affectionately as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. They promised to ensure civil and religious rights for the Arabs, but made no mention of their political rights. This is like renting out a house and telling the tenant, "You are free to choose the color of the curtains," but forgetting to tell them if they actually get to live in the house. In 1922, after World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire departed, Britain officially took control of the mandatory Palestine, and they began to implement that second deal, allowing Jewish immigration. Tens of thousands of Jews from Europe moved there. The Jewish population in Palestine doubled by 1931 compared to 1922. These migrations fueled the Zionist movement. They had a great slogan: "A land without people for a people without land." There was just one tiny, minuscule problem with this slogan. Palestine already had people, and the Palestinian Arabs were still the majority. Jews continued to immigrate, acquiring fertile lands, and violence escalated. The Arabs, feeling cheated, revolted against both the British and the Jews, but they were brutally suppressed. The British, in their role as protector, brought in troops from as far as India to quell the riots, killing thousands of Palestinians and, ironically, training Jewish forces to suppress the revolts. The situation became so dire that even the British felt something was a bit off. They began to restrict Jewish immigration in the 1930s. But this, slamming on the brakes, angered the Jewish extremist factions. They formed militias, turning against both the British and the Arabs. The height of the tragedy was the bloody Holocaust by Nazi Germany during World War II, 1941 to 1945. Millions of Jews were murdered. The survivors, with nowhere else to go, tried every means to flee to Palestine. This wave of migration caused the violence to escalate exponentially. In 1947, Britain, after stirring everything into a mess, decided to do a very British thing. They declared they gave up and were washing their hands of the Palestine problem. Like an exhausted landlord tired of two tenants constantly fighting, Britain decided to close shop and toss this hot potato to the United Nations, the New Kid on the Block organization. The UN, in its role as a rookie mediator, proposed a solution that sounded very fair: the 1947 Partition Plan. They took out a map, drew a line, and divided Palestine into two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. The holy city of Jerusalem would become an international special zone, belonging to no one. The idea was to establish a state for the Jews while also giving the Palestinians independence from the British. Two birds with one stone. The problem was, the way the cake was cut was not even. 56% of the land, including the most fertile areas, was given to the Jews, even though they were less than half the population at the time. The Palestinians, of course, saw this as an act of legalized land theft by colonialism. This was their ancestral land for over 1,000 years, suddenly being carved up by some organization from who knows where. And then, on May 14, 1948, the British officially packed their bags and left. The very same day, the State of Israel declared its independence. The Israelis began to implement Plan Dalet, taking the lands allotted to them. But not only that, they also encroached on lands intended for the Arab state. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were forced to flee, destroyed, and all traces of the Palestinians were erased. Immediately, Neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, declared war on Israel, with the stated goal of establishing a unified Palestinian state. A war broke out, and a classic upset scenario occurred. The fledgling state of Israel somehow managed to win against the siege of the entire Arab coalition. Not only did they keep their land, but they also conveniently captured the western half of Jerusalem and most of the territory that the UN had drawn for the Palestinian state. They controlled almost the entire territory except for the Gaza Strip, managed by Egypt, and the West Bank, managed by Jordan. The consequences of this war: over 500 Palestinian villages destroyed, 15,000 people killed, and most tragically, over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled, becoming refugees in their own homeland. They had to flee to Egypt, Jordan, Syria. This disaster is what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this was the pilot episode for many decades of bloody conflict. In the 1960s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was formed. Initially, their goal was very clear: fight for a Palestinian state, reclaim all of the former British Palestine, and eliminate the State of Israel. This led to prolonged clashes. It was only much later that the PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, agreed to accept a land-sharing solution. But that's a story for later. Meanwhile, many Israelis began to move in and live in Gaza and the West Bank, Palestinian territories occupied by Israel. Settlements sprang up. Some people came for religious reasons, believing it was their promised land. Others came simply because the housing was cheap, the view was great, and it was subsidized by the government. Even though the international community, including allies like the US, considers these settlements illegal, they continued to spring up like mushrooms after a rain. This caused Palestinians to lose more land and fragmented their communities, making the establishment of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state even more impossible. In 1967, the Six-Day War broke out. In just 6 days, Israel went on a spectacular territorial shopping spree. They captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In just 1 week, Israel controlled all of historic Palestine, including all of Jerusalem. Millions of Palestinians suddenly found themselves living under Israeli military occupation. In 1978, the US decided to play mediator, brokering the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. This was a historic deal. Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula, a giant desert, in exchange for Egypt, the largest Arab nation, officially recognizing Israel's existence. Needless to say, the entire Arab bloc was furious. They saw it as a betrayal. The Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, who signed the accord, paid for it with his life in an assassination a few years later. This agreement helped cool tensions between Israel and Egypt. But the main cauldron, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, remained, as Israel still occupied Gaza and the West Bank. In 1987, Palestinian dissatisfaction with the occupation reached its peak. The First Intifada uprising broke out. This was not a war of tanks and planes. It was a war of stones, clubs, and street protests. Protests and riots spread. Israel responded with force. Hundreds of Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians were killed. At the same time, in the Gaza Strip, a new character appeared: Hamas. This was an extremist Islamic group that opposed the PLO, believing the PLO was too soft, too compromising. Hamas set a clear goal: destroy Israel, and was determined to spoil the game of any negotiation efforts between the PLO and Israel. In the early 1990s, the world saw a glimmer of hope. The Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the PLO. This was a historic handshake on the White House lawn. Everyone thought this was the series finale, the happy ending. The Accords opened up the possibility for Palestinian self-rule and a path toward Israeli withdrawal. But, as usual in this drama, the extremists on both sides didn't like the peace script. Hamas immediately carried out suicide bombings to sabotage the process. Meanwhile, the Israeli far-right criticized their prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin. And then, tragedy struck. Prime Minister Rabin himself was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. Rabin's death all but killed the hope for peace. Although negotiations continued, like at Camp David II in 2000, they all failed. In 2000, Part 2 of the uprising began, the Second Intifada. This time it was much more violent and far bloodier. The uprising lasted 5 years, leaving 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians dead. This uprising completely changed the dynamic. Israelis, after waves of suicide bombings, lost faith in peace. Instead of negotiating, they built massive security barriers and checkpoints to tightly control the Palestinians. On the Palestinian side, they realized that neither negotiations, Oslo, nor violence, Intifada, had brought them an independent state. In 2005, Israel unilaterally disengaged from Gaza. It sounds like a positive move, but in reality they pulled their troops and settlers out, and then besieged the Gaza Strip from the outside with a formidable barrier, tightly controlling everything that went in or out, from goods to people. Palestinians in the West Bank continued to live under occupation, with settlements ever expanding. The conflict continued, and the dream of an independent state for Palestinians became more distant than ever. And so we return to the current season of this long-running drama. With the recent hot events, the conflict is no longer confined to Gaza or the West Bank. It is escalating and dragging in strong involvement from the region's big players. The US, Israel's close ally, has responded by deploying a fleet of 12 warships, including an aircraft carrier and destroyers, along with thousands of Marines, to the region. The purpose is to support Israel and intimidate threats from Iran and its friend groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Hezbollah, with Iran's backing, has joined the fun by increasing its attacks on northern Israel, claiming revenge for the death of the Hamas leader. At the same time, the Houthi forces in Yemen, famous for shooting first and asking questions later, have also intensified their missile and drone attacks on anything they deem related to Israel and its US allies. Meanwhile, in another corner, Russia is not sitting on the sidelines. They have supplied weapons, including advanced air defense systems to Iran, helping their good buddy strengthen its defensive capabilities against threats from the West and Israel. After many decades of confrontation, tension, failed negotiations, and endless violence, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is in one of its darkest chapters, threatening the stability of the entire region and the world. The dream of peace for these two peoples, already fragile, has now become more distant than ever. And that is our story for today. Thank you for watching.